Hello and welcome to the Human Progress Podcast. Today I will be talking to Dr. Kristian Niemietz. Kristian is the head of political economy at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. He joined the IEA in 2008 as a poverty research fellow, becoming its senior research fellow in 2013 and head of health and welfare in 2015. Kristian studied economics at the Humboldt-Universität to Berlin and Universidad de Salamanca in Spain. During his studies, he interned at the Central Bank of Bolivia and the National Statistics Office in Paraguay. Kristian holds a PhD in political economy from King's College London, where he also taught economics. And today we'll be talking about his 2019 book, Socialism, the failed idea that never dies, and the general fascinations that people, especially young people, have with a system that has failed whenever it was tried. So, Kristian, welcome.
Hello, thanks for the invitation.
My absolute pleasure. So, conducting this podcast as we do in 2022, it is perhaps valuable to go back in time and to talk about the origins of the socialist idea, its classical definition, and how, if at all, its meaning has changed over time. So let's start with history. Where does socialism come from?
Well, that's hard to say. There was a socialism before Marx and Engels, and they recognized that. They talked about, they said what happened before them was utopian socialism, and then they said, but what we do is completely different. We're doing scientific socialism, and this is a qualitative step forward. So there were always thinkers, writers who talked about egalitarian societies, societies in which everything is organized communally. So early utopian literature is based on that, but they would not have a clear, precise theory how a society of that type would be organized. And Marx and Engels then changed a couple of things. First of all, they said for them, socialism was not simply an option. They didn't say, look, this is the system you have, but we have a proposal for a better one. That's not what they did. But they thought that capitalism would eventually get into a crisis of its own making. It would not be sustainable, and socialism would just be the logical next step. It would have to happen anyway. They saw it as something inevitable. So they didn't see themselves as the people who invented a new system and that would come about because they described it or made the case for it, but rather as something that had to happen as a law of history. So inevitability, and what they brought in also was the idea of that every type of social system, economic system, has a ruling class. That there's always a group of people who are in charge, and as they saw it in antiquity, those would have been in ancient Rome or ancient Greece. This would have been slave owners. Then in the Middle Ages, this would have been the aristocracy, feudal landowners, and under capitalism, they thought it's the bourgeoisie, the people who own capital, who own the factories. These are the ruling class. Ruling class means that they're not just economically powerful. Then ruling class doesn't just mean rich people, but Marx and Engels thought if you own the means of production, whatever that is, land under feudalism, capital under capitalism, whoever owns the means of production also holds political power. So it's the idea that you cannot separate economic power from political power. If you own the means of production, the group of people who do that, they will be the ruling class. And that's how Marx and Engels differed from more utopian kinds of socialists. There were, around the same time, there was a movement in Britain led by Robert Owen, who was a factory owner. He set up several communities, egalitarian collective communities that he called socialists, and he called himself a socialist. And but these were all voluntary associations. You could move to one of those places. You didn't have to. And Owens didn't say, I want to organize the whole of society in that way. And of course, Robert Owens was himself a capitalist in Marxist terms. He was a factory owner. So Marx and Engels would have said, no, that's not the way to go. This guy is himself part of the ruling class, and you're not going to get socialism in this way. What has to happen is the working class as a whole has to organize itself, overthrow the ruling class, and then establish this new system. So yeah, short summary where it comes from, I can't say exactly. I'd say that the idea of a collectively organized community, a communally organized economy, that's something that's always been with us. And probably because that's how our ancestors lived. If you go back far enough, hunter-gatherer societies, prehistoric societies, they practiced a sort of proto-communism, and that's what Marx said as well. They said this was, in ancient times, you had a kind of primitive communism, and one day we will replicate that just at a much, much, much higher level of economic development.
Mm-hmm. And sophistication. So in the past, like, for example, if you look at Plato's Republic, or if you look at Thomas More's Utopia, they simply assume that the best society would be one where things are held in common, but they didn't have any sort of scientific accoutrement. They didn't have any theory about how this would work, but Marx did. Are there any intimations of central planning in Marx? Did he have a clear idea how the economy? I mean, obviously he believed in communal ownership of property, especially means of production, but he didn't really, as far as I know, come up with the notion of central planning. Yet that is where we end up, right? So was that sort of an inevitable process that central planning emerges in Central and Eastern Europe and Soviet Russia after the communists take over? Let's think about the system as it functions in its heyday, say 1960.
Yes, that is inevitable. And you are quite right. Marx did not spell out how exactly a planned economy should work, or didn't even use the term planned economy. He didn't talk about 5-year plans or anything of that sort. And that was quite deliberate. Marx said, we don't know what socialist society will look like in practice, and it would be futile to speculate on that. And if you think that this is just inevitable, something that is going to happen anyway, then that kind of makes sense. Then, of course, you don't feel obliged to spell out exactly how it will work, because it would be, if I propose a particular reform, then of course you would say, well, you have to tell me how this is supposed to work, because you're the one making that case. But Marx and Engels did not see themselves in that way. They thought they are just analyzing the laws of history, and this is just what has to happen. So therefore,
the law of history leads from sort of in slaving society in antiquity through feudalism, through capitalism, to communism, which is the apex, the climax of human history, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. That would be the highest point and the end of history. Yes, they did believe that societies have to evolve through these various stages, starting with the very early primitive communism of prehistoric societies, then antiquity, slave owner societies, then the Middle Ages, feudalism, with aristocracy as the ruling class, then capitalism as a higher stage, ahead of and an improvement over feudalism. Capitalism would create the conditions, it would create the technologies and the required capital, and it would lead to the development of a working class, and then ultimately that working class would develop class consciousness. They would realize, hey, we're all in the same boat here and we're all being exploited. Let's do something about this. And they would then become the ruling class, and that would be the first step of the new society. You would have, it would still be a society with a ruling class. It's just that the working class would then be the ruling class. But then eventually there would not be There would be no social classes at all anymore. And in Marxist theory, the state is always an instrument of the ruling class. You only need a state when you have a ruling class and that needs to oppress other classes. But when you have no social classes anymore, then in Marxist theory, you don't need a state. That's why he thought that eventually the final utopia would be just a classless and stateless society. So that would not be central planning. That would just be people getting together spontaneously, producing stuff. Nobody would organize this. There would be no organization, and there would be no police either. You wouldn't need any state institutions. But that would be the highest stage. He thought that this new society that they were talking about would come in two stages. In the beginning, you have a state, and that state would just be a state collectively managed by the working class in Marxist mythology, and then eventually it would just disappear. And then Lenin changed the terminology a bit later on. He started to call this first stage, the planned economy, the state that supposedly represents the working class, he called that socialism, and he called the future society, the final utopia, he called that communism. So Marx and Engels did not see socialism and communism as separate things, but Lenin then did. He said the kind of society that we're establishing here, the early USSR, that would be socialism. And the idea was that it would eventually grow into communism, because the state would just be less and less needed as the working class just spontaneously self-organizes. It's just that, of course, never happened anywhere. Once you had a socialist state in power that claimed to be the instrument of the working class, that state just never shrank. It just grew bigger or stayed the way it was and remained repressive. So that's one of the many things where things didn't work out the way Marx thought. But yeah, it would be for that reason that Marx did not envision that it would ultimately be state planning. That would just be something that you'd need in the early stages. And even then, he didn't describe any specific institutions. So it's not that the Soviets, that Lenin and Stalin could just read Marx and then create the sorts of institutions that he talked about. It was not a blueprint. But he did talk about the working class managing its affairs collectively, planning its economy. So that means a 5-year plan, the sort of economy that we saw in the Eastern Bloc and Maoist China, or Cuba today, North Korea today, that's not at all incompatible with what Marx said. That is one way of reading it.
Right. So instead of the state, the government, the bureaucracy becoming less important, leading eventually to the dissolution of the state, under socialism, it became more and more important, because the only way that you could organize the productive capacity of the economy without a fully functioning price system, without the free markets, was through central planning and dictates from above. Would that be correct?
That's exactly right. That's exactly what happened. And you then got economies which quickly became very bureaucratic and hierarchical. And whenever that happens, you get the Western sympathizers looking at a system like that and recognizing, this doesn't look at all like what Marx had in mind. And Western socialists then conclude, but that probably means that they just misunderstood the idea. They didn't take Marx seriously enough. They deviated from what Marx really wanted. But in reality, the reason why these societies turned out in that way is precisely what you described, that once you no longer have market prices, once you no longer have market mechanisms, the kinds of things that coordinate the economies that we live in today, once you no longer have that, you only have a choice between chaos and top-down planning. And faced with that choice, of course, socialist leaders choose top-down planning, because they'd rather have a centrally planned economy than no economy. And that was the choice that that the Bolsheviks faced. They were just completely unprepared for. I mean, they didn't start with the intention of having 5-year plans and a planning bureaucracy that comes up with these mandates and then forces everyone at gunpoint to do what the planners told them to do or set out in their plan. That wasn't the idea, but rather they had a rather naive idea. Lenin, until just before the revolution, still talked about and wrote about how easy it would be once there is no capitalist ruling class anymore. The workers would just spontaneously self-organize and the state would not have to do very much. That's what Lenin wrote in 1917, a few months before he actually came to power. That's really how he imagined it. I mean, Lenin was a clever guy, obviously, but on those things that really matter, on the economics, he was just hopelessly naive. He just really imagined the creation of a socialist state to be more or less like the abolition of slavery, right? If you think of the abolition of slavery there, it would also be true to say that there was no exact plan for how exactly it should happen, what exactly should happen afterwards, because the idea was simply, well, once you've got rid of slavery, it's up to the freed slaves to lead their lives in the way they see fit. It's not the job of any political reformer to come up with any detailed plan for that. And that's more or less, I think, how Lenin imagined the abolition of capitalism would work. That you see this in the terminology that Marxists talk about wage slavery. They really saw an analogy between actual slavery and the kind of work relationship that we see in the capitalist economy. And if you think of it in that way, then it's kind of obvious that you would think, well, just get rid of that institution, get rid of that ruling class, and the rest will sort itself out. Because if you're talking about actual slavery, that would be the correct way to think about it. You just need to get rid of the slave owners and the rest will sort itself out. In that case, it would be correct. But to draw an analogy between slavery and capitalism and the market economy is, of course, completely wrong. And that is the short summary of why Lenin got it so wrong.
Under communism, the idea was that once you get rid of the managers and the owners of the means of production, the capital, then every penny that the worker produces goes in his pocket. He no longer has to share the fruit of his labor, so to speak, with the capitalist, right? Mm-hmm. So this is the notion of that again, the workers are best suited to run the enterprises. Mm-hmm. Whereas in capitalism, what we have discovered and what still appears to be the case is that on top of the workforce, you still need people who make decisions on what products need to be actually produced. They have to research the marketplace and see what the gaps are, and they are compensated for it. There is a role for a CEO.
Yes, there is a role for entrepreneurship. Once you have a factory that's up and running and that's working successfully, then it would be true to say, well, if the managers and the owners just disappeared, wouldn't this factory just keep going? The workers know what to do. Can't they just carry on? Once that factory is there and you have a production concept and it's part of a production process, then yes, that's true. But of course, factories don't just spontaneously spring up. Somebody has to have an idea what the market might actually want, what the best way to organize a production process might be. and so forth. And once it's there, yes, you can then, if the owners disappeared, it could go on for a while. But even then, market conditions would change, and a factory that is, or any company that is well adjusted to consumer demand as it is now, doesn't stay that way for long. You still need somebody making the strategic decisions. But I can see why. If you go to a company, if you visit, let's say, a successful pub, a pub that has lots of customers and there's a lot of money coming in, I can see why you could think, well, the people pulling the pints here, they probably don't make much more than the minimum wage. They do all the hard work. They are the ones who keep the show on the road. What does the owner actually contribute? It's not that immediately visible. And to Marxists, it was just not visible at all. They, as you said, thought of capitalists as parasites. Or more precisely, they did think that the bourgeoisie had a useful role to play in the very early stages of capitalism. There, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx talks about the bourgeoisie in almost flattering terms, saying that they've unleashed great productive potential. But in more advanced capitalist societies, they did think that the bourgeoisie has outlived its usefulness, and now they're just a bunch of parasites. If you think of them of capital owners in that way, then of course you would also think that removing them from the process is very easy. Because if somebody is literally just a parasite, what happens if you remove them? Well, things carry on as before, just better. And that's why they thought that it would be just very easy to switch from a capitalist society to an, in their mythology, worker-run one. It's just that every time you do take the capitalist out of the equation, it turns out, oh, they actually do something useful, and now that they're no longer there, something is missing here. So you always notice that once it's a sort of you miss it when it's gone thing. But it's also, you could make the same argument about an individual company within capitalism. If it's so obvious that the owners don't add anything, if it's so obvious that it's really just the workers who do everything and who create all the value, why don't they just leave the company and set up their own collective then? If the company owner doesn't add anything, if they just sit there and collect the profits, why would you tolerate them at all? Wouldn't they just, you could imagine everyone who works at Amazon just walking out collectively and setting up the alternative, the workers' Amazon or the people's Amazon, where they could even use a similar logo, so that for consumers it doesn't feel like too much of a change. If the consumer has an attachment to the actual Amazon, you could emphasize the continuity. You could tell everyone it would be like before, except the big bad capitalists aren't there anymore, and we're now running the show ourselves. But the reason that doesn't happen is that of course capitalists do play a useful role, and there was, that's an old debate between economists in the 19th century. It was the Austrian school of economics which clarified that point. They said profits are not wasted, and that there's nothing parasitical about them. Profits are a reward for various things. First of all, for risk taking. That if you set up a company, there's of course a risk that you might never make any money from it, and that's different from taking a job where you know that at the end of the month you get paid. So that's one reason why it's wrong to concentrate on the successful businesses and say, couldn't this business also run just with the workforce without an owner. Yeah, okay, but you also need to look at the many businesses that never made it to that stage because they fail early on, and that's in a capitalist economy. That's the majority of enterprises. The majority, more than half of all companies that are set up at any given time, will not be there anymore 5 years later. So you have a huge turnover, and that's because you can't predict what's going to work and what doesn't. You need risk takers, and there's nothing wrong with risk taking being rewarded. And then there's, of course, the patience aspect. The reason why, well, if you had a choice between $100 today or $100 in 2 years, you would, of course, prefer to have it now. And that's why if I want you to be patient, I need to offer you some reward for that. I then have to say, okay, rather than a choice between $100 today and $100 in 2 years, how about the other option would be $110 in 2 years' time? And then you can think, oh, okay, if I wait a bit, I get more, then that changes the calculation. So the capitalist is not a parasite. The capitalist is rewarded for the risk taking, for the patience, and if they're themselves actively involved with the company, for the entrepreneurship, having the idea, organizing stuff, working out the production process.
So that's all very valuable, and I think the last bit is particularly useful to understand, is that the entrepreneur has the idea. He has identified, or she, of course, they have identified a gap in the market that they want to fill with a new product or a new service, and so the labor theory of value, which I think Adam Smith had and then Marx adopted, thinks that all value comes from the productivity of the workers. But in fact, there is also value to be derived from the discovery process of the entrepreneur, him or her searching for new ideas and then creating those products and services. And by removing the entrepreneur from the equation, which is what the Soviets did, they could still produce, but with antiquated technology. The difference between Eastern Europe when I lived there and Western Europe was not that we didn't have cars. It's just that our cars were 30 or 40 years out of date, whilst the West Germans were driving beautiful BMWs, East Germans had to drive Trabants and things like that. So in a way, I think one could also think about socialism as a very static idea of the economy. Well, we've already discovered cars, we have already discovered bicycles, we have already discovered how to grow potatoes, so we just now give it to the workers to do. But there are also other things that could be discovered in the future, like SpaceX or the internet, that the communists could never do because precisely they didn't have those entrepreneurs. So we get into, let's say, the 1970s and the 1980s, and this centrally planned economic model, which is prevalent throughout the Soviet bloc, begins to sputter. It's obvious that it is not growing as fast as the communists would like. So you know, by 1989, when communism collapses, I would say, at what point do you think people started to realize that socialism was not the way forward? Because in 1960, it was clear that people still thought communism worked. But by 1989, it had collapsed. So what was the period of kind of realization that socialism was not going to be the wave of the future?
Unfortunately, there was never a widespread realization of that. There was a realization at some point in the Cold War that Eastern Bloc socialism was not the way to go. But by then, Western socialists had already quite successfully distanced themselves from that. In the 60s, it was Soviet Eastern Bloc socialism was already very much passé, had fallen out of fashion. That was the heyday of Third Worldism, where they romanticized regimes in China, Vietnam, and Cuba instead, rather than saying the Soviet Union is the lodestar of the future. When exactly that had happened, and yeah, I don't know, it differs a bit from place to place. There was in the 50s, I think there's still were Western economists who thought the Soviet economy was actually doing very well, was catching up with the West, and that they would eventually catch up completely. It had somewhat fallen out of fashion because people had realized that it was bad in other ways, and because of the repressiveness and all that. But I think the economy as such still had a fairly high, a fairly good reputation. What must have changed that was that that wherever you had an economy like that, people were running away. That was the big issue. So the Berlin Wall was not just about. It's not that everyone just enjoyed the greater freedom that they had in West Germany, although that was a factor. But there were the people who escaped until 1961. A lot of them, I would imagine, were quite apolitical. They didn't necessarily care that much about whether they can read dozens of newspapers or whether they can only consume state-controlled information. But it was more, they clearly had materially higher living standards in the West. And I don't want to dismiss that there's absolutely nothing wrong with valuing a nicer standard of living. And it was clear at the time that they weren't getting it in that system. And people must have realized then, if you have to build walls and fences with barbed wire to keep people in, then there must be something amiss with a system of that kind. But I think it was only a brief period in the 90s that this was generalized, that that it was a widespread opinion that that planned economies per se are a bad idea, because
that's a very good segue to my next question. So in its heyday, socialism is about central planning. It is about shortages because central planning doesn't work. They need to put up watchtowers and barbed wire to keep people from escaping. It all comes down. What do you think that socialism means to people today?
That's part of the problem. It's a bit more confused than it would have been in the 60s or 30s. Because these earlier waves of socialism enthusiasts had a clear model that they were looking at. In the 30s, lots of Western intellectuals were idolizing, lionizing the Soviet Union. The student radicals of the 60s, early 70s were glamorizing Maoist China, North Vietnam. They may not have known a great deal about them, but they, at least from afar, admired those societies. And would have said, that's socialism, that's the thing we want. Now, socialists can't point to anything. There was, until a couple of years ago, there was Venezuela, but of course we know how that ended, and therefore that also, as always, became not real socialism, as they always do after a while. It's a bit confused. I think nowadays socialists just describe their ideas in very abstract terms. And so they talk about a society that's democratically run by the workers. It's often they often emphasize that democratic aspect. They would say, in the current economy, you have people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos in charge, and they are like aristocrats in the Middle Ages. They're feudalists, essentially capitalist feudalists. and we will replace all that with democracy and just have this rhetoric. Wouldn't it be lovely if we planned everything together and run things democratically, collectively, without hierarchies? That's the kind of idea. That's the kind of rhetoric that you get, and but few of them spell out how that's supposed to work. I mean, in my book, I try to be as fair as I can, and I think we can afford to be fair, because our ideas are clearly the better ones, are clearly right. So I have no need to strawman anyone. I have no need to pick on the weakest case for socialism. Our case is so much stronger than that. I can pick the strongest case that I can find and still say, okay, this is good as far as it goes, but liberal free marketism is still vastly better than that. But the problem I had was that even though I did try to find a good description of how the new wave of socialists imagined a future socialist society, I didn't find it. And that didn't change in the years since. There have been a couple of books which came out since then, some just after my book, some a year or two after. So there is, for example, there's the Socialist Manifesto, written by Bhaskar Sunkara, who is the founder of Jacobin magazine. You've probably come across Jacobin. They are part of this millennial socialism wave. And then there's Current Affairs magazine, which is also part of that millennial socialism wave. And their editor and founder, Nathan Robinson, he also wrote a book called Why You Should Be a Socialist. And there's a couple of those. There's Fully Automated Luxury Communism by Aaron Bastani, who is from Novara Media, which is sort of the UK equivalent of Jacobin. So there's several of these outlets, and the people who are big in that movement write their manifestos. I've read several of those, but what I said in the book, I think, still stands. None of them can really describe how their socialist society is supposed to operate. It's all, they talk in highly abstract terms. They escape into abstraction. They talk about the outcomes they would like to see, rather than any mechanisms for delivering that, and even then only in very vague general terms. So
it's like I have an idea, then a bit of sprinkling of magic dust.
Yes.
Prosperity.
Yes, details to be confirmed. But he uses all these buzzwords about the workers, and everything will be run democratically, and it will be empowering and driven by the people, and all of those fashionable buzzwords. But I have yet to find one that really goes a bit beyond the platitudes. And I've really looked at not some crank fringe figures. I could quite easily read something from the Socialist Workers' Party, which is one of our far left fringe parties, and say, look at how silly this is. But I've tried to be fair. Look at what the more mainstream figures are saying, the ones who seriously think about this, and who write books about it, and who clearly think about these issues every day. You would think these, if there's anyone who has come up with a concept of what millennial socialism actually is, it would be one of those figures. None of them can. I mean, that's the whole problem with the socialism wave, that it is very confused.
So in a way, we are back to Lenin before 1917, in a sense that, the idea is there, but how you get to prosperity is still very much to be determined. Now, you said in your previous comment that you try to be very, very correct, not to pick on straw men, etc. So let's look at one example. Throughout the socialist days, the 4 decades of socialism in Central and Eastern Europe, East Germany was always seen as the sort of the best performing communist country, which probably had to do something with Germans being very productive people. But be it as it may, let's look at German performance on the East and the West side from, say, the end of Second World War until 1990. What were the practical consequences of West Germany having a sort of mixed, almost capitalist system, and then East Germany having a communist system? How did it translate into standards of living and GDP?
Oh, well, that's easily summarized because we have very good data from the time of reunification, because there Eastern Germany just became part of the West German, or now unified German, system of national accounts, and their GDP per capita was about or just over a third of the Western level. And that means that even if you look at the poorest region in the old West Germany, which was, I think, Schleswig-Holstein in the north, old shipbuilding area, that would have been the poorest part of West Germany. And you compare that to the richest part of East Germany, which was the state of Saxony, the old industrial center. Even then, the poorest part of West Germany was still 2.5 times as rich as the richest part of East Germany. And that is also why if you talk to any East German, let's say from my age upwards, meaning they have at least childhood memories of reunification or more than that, or clearer memories, they will all remember the first time they set foot into a Western supermarket, or they bought Western products. They will still remember that, even the ones who were 9 years old at the time. I mean, I studied in East Berlin, and a lot of the people I studied with were from there or around there originally, and they would have been 9-10 years old around the time that the wall came down. And they all remember that, and how amazing that was. Unfortunately, that hasn't made them more capitalist. Logically, they should be fierce defenders of capitalism, but they also buy into this idea that the Socialist Unity Party just did it in the wrong way, and that it could have been completely different. Again, in a details to be confirmed way. But yeah, that would be an example where you have perhaps the best starting conditions for socialism that a socialist could ask for. Because in the Soviet case, a lot of socialists would say that there it just degenerated because because they were poor to begin with, and supposedly Marx said you have to start when capitalism is already very advanced, and that was not the case in the old Russian Empire. Now, you couldn't say that about East Germany, which was highly developed and industrialized long before it became socialist. The industries, all of that was I mean, Saxony, and I mentioned Saxony. That was an old industrial heartland. You really had all the productive potential there, and just as importantly, for the socialist theory, there you had a highly educated working class, because a lot of Western socialism apologists later said it failed in the Soviet Union because there was no self-organized working class. They didn't have that tradition. They weren't educated enough. They didn't have the capacity for self-management and all that. Well, okay, if that were true, then clearly Eastern Germany or any part of Germany would have been the ideal test case, because they had working class organizations since at least the mid-19th century, and a very highly developed culture of working class self-management, self-organization. I mean, to this day, there are lots of organizations around that date from that period, when you had a well-developed culture of working class people getting together, running things together. It's just that in practice, these types of organizations were suppressed in the GDR, whereas it was in West Germany that they were allowed to thrive again after the war. There was a comeback, where a lot of the old associations came back, and it was in East Germany that they were suppressed. Now, this having working class self-organization doesn't help if you want to build up a planned economy, because yes, you have some organizations that exist for a particular purpose. Let's say a center for adult education, run by volunteers, by working class people, for those who didn't have the opportunity to get a good school education. They would organize libraries and book clubs and so forth, making it easier to learn to read and write and learn about abstract ideas, that kind of thing. That was all going on in 19th century Germany and survived until the 20th, into the 20th century. Now, you can't use those organizations to run socialism, because they exist for a particular purpose. They run a community library. They run forest chalets for hiking trips and things like that. But they're not there to draft 5-year plans. They're not there to run the steel sector. They're not there to come up with production figures for the Trabant. So therefore, the idea that just because you have working class self-organization, you can somehow transform that into socialism is completely wrong. But the East German case is as favorable as it gets for socialists, and still the result, even though, as you said, it may have been the best example of its kind, but still far worse than the relevant counterfactual.
Yeah, I mean, if I recall correctly, in the early 20th century, people assumed that if socialism was to be born and implemented, it would be done in Germany, precisely because it was such a sophisticated economy with such a great sense of working class consciousness. But of course, socialism had to wait. I mean, socialism was eventually implemented in Soviet Russia. And when it eventually came to Germany after the Second World War in the form of the German Democratic Republic, it turns out that in a scope of 40 years, the West German capitalist model, people there earned 66% more than in East Germany. In other words, it failed. Do you have any favorite examples? I mean, you've written a book about the catastrophe, which was socialism wherever it was tried. Do you have any examples that are particularly jarring, particularly silly examples of socialist dysfunction that you've encountered in your research?
Well, my favorite anecdote, even though it doesn't really say much, is that when the Soviet Union was finally dissolved, that final conference where that was decided, and they wanted to sign, Gorbachev wanted to sign the treaty that would finally dissolve it. The pen didn't work, and they had to borrow a Western-made pen from, I think, a TV crew. Now, okay, to be totally fair, it could be that the pen just went dry, and that, of course, happens with the best pens in the world. But I still think it's nice symbolism, and it's kind of fitting that even a system so useless that it cannot even dissolve itself in peace.
Now, one of the great attractions, I think, to young people today who don't think about economics is that socialism has this aura of a society which has a number of sort of moral elements that are perceived as being desirable. We already talked about the labor theory of value, that it's the workers who should keep the money that the company produces rather than capitalists or entrepreneurs. But for some reason, especially the youth had come to associate socialism very often with things like equality, human dignity, female empowerment, even things like gay rights. It's not that difficult in the United States see a lot of people sort of equalizing or trying to make the case that a socialist society would be good for the minorities. What was the actual practical effect of socialism when it was tried for minority position in those societies? For example, I know for a fact that no woman in Eastern Bloc has ever ascended to the position of power, unless you think about Ceausescu's wife. All of these societies were run by men. So first of all, where does that tying together of socialism and good things in life come from? And did the socialists actually make any progress on those things?
Okay, I think it simply comes from the fact that in Western countries, the type of person who would describe themselves as a socialist is will almost always be someone who is also a fan of Black Lives Matter, and who is just a woke progressive, and who is very much in favor of trans rights. And they would probably just think, okay, if these things come as a package deal here in the West, then maybe that says something about the system. Maybe the system itself is therefore somehow more progressive. So it may come from that, whereas in reality, some socialist societies were, of course, quite socially conservative. That's one of the things that we get some socialists here who sometimes gleefully talk about surveys in Eastern Europe where a fairly high proportion of people say they want the old system back. And they then say, our socialists then say, look, the people who have experienced it actually like it. So it isn't just Western hipsters. But the trouble is, that is often, it's often not specifically the socialist aspects that they're missing, but it could be the conservative aspects. It could be someone who associates the old system with tough policing, tough on crime, or just, I think this is particularly true in Eastern Germany, that that some people associate the GDR with low levels of migration, which was of course true, because why would you migrate to the GDR? West Germany was a much more multicultural society because it had people, because it was just a magnet. It was the sort of place that people wanted to move to, which East Germany wasn't. But there is, I remember that it used to be the case for a long time that journalists were always perplexed by the fact that you often saw a lot of voter migration from the far left to the far right, and in the opposite direction. And I've seen lots of articles where journalists are puzzling about that, saying, how can this happen? Why would you move from one extreme to the other? What actually happens is that some socialist societies were actually quite socially conservative in some ways. It's not that they were progressive throughout the board. I mean, in Eastern Germany, for example, for a while they tried to keep out rock music because they thought that was Western bourgeois degeneracy. There's a movie set in, I think must be the 60s, about someone who smuggles Rolling Stones records from West Berlin to East Berlin, and it was in a lot of ways far more socially conservative than the Western counterpart. And it's therefore particularly strange that self-described progressives would identify with such a system and think that their values would prevail in such a system.
If I recall correctly, Hitler once said that a communist makes the best Nazi. And I think that I think it's very important what you said about people not necessarily longing for the shortages of the central planning and the socialism, but they may be longing for other things such as homogeneity, the stasis, the sense of stability, which obviously stagnation brings with it. That may be one of the things that they are looking forward to.
Yes, although we have to be totally fair here. There are examples where if you care about things like women's equality and rights for minorities, you can also find positive examples from socialist societies. And that would be because it always depends on what socialism replaces, depends on what the alternative is. So if you have, for example, perhaps here the best case one can find there would be Afghanistan. They had a Soviet-backed socialist regime before the Taliban takeover, or for a while, literally Soviet-occupied. And yeah, social indicators, of course, went into reverse after the Taliban takeover. So there you could say, if the choice is between socialism and Western-style liberalism, then of course Western liberalism is always preferable in every way. But if it's a choice between socialism and the rule of the Taliban, then, well, even I might say, no, then I actually prefer the socialists.
I see. So, for example, when the feudal society pre-Soviet invasion was removed and girls, for example, were allowed to go to school for the first time, that would clearly be an improvement on the previous regime. I think that's, yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, China, similar case. If you have very socially conservative societies and then you have a socialist regime taking over, then you can see social improvements in some respects.
Makes sense. So in 1989, most people thought that socialist experiment was over. And, you know, we already touched on this subject. Today, socialism is experiencing something of a resurgence. So what explains that, especially when it comes to Western societies? For example, is there something inherent to human nature that makes socialism attractive? You already talked about the hunter-gathering societies, small communal living off the land, sharing of meat, very egalitarian in terms of hierarchy. Is it genetic? Are we genetically pre-programmed to find the idea of socialism appealing?
Probably, yes. I discussed that I think in the final chapter of the book, and even though I make clear that this isn't my area of expertise and I don't want to make any definitive statements here, but I know that people have made that argument that we find capitalism counterintuitive because we are just not well adjusted to the kind of economy we have today, based on a division of labor and impersonal mechanisms. And you can also see that we often talk about economic outcomes as if we imagined that somebody plans them. When we say, but isn't it unfair that this group earns less than that group? Which is the kind of logic, okay, if you had a central planner who decided wages, who says, okay, I want this group to earn this much, that group to earn that much, then you could say, wait, why did you make that choice? Isn't that unfair? Whereas if it's just brought about by an impersonal mechanism, then you can't really apply that logic of fair or unfair. But we seem to struggle with that concept. We talk about economic outcomes as if somebody had decided them, as if somebody had imposed them. We look for some agent, somebody who makes decisions, and in a capitalist economy where there clearly is no person who is in charge overall, we attribute human characteristics to capitalism. You can see this, that anti-capitalists often talk about capitalism the way you would talk about a person. Capitalism does this, capitalism does that, capitalism thinks that, capitalism promotes materialism, capitalism thinks that only cash incentives matter, that kind of thing. That's the way you would talk about a person, and a fairly unpleasant person, I guess. But that is probably that bias, that our moral impulses are just not well adjusted to the kind of economy that we live in today. And part of us longs for that communal economy, and that's what socialism is. It wouldn't, or supposed to be, that wouldn't explain the recent resurgence, because if you talk about something that's part of human nature, you would expect it to be constant. And support for socialism isn't exactly constant. It's more, it does come and go in waves. So you need something else as well. But yes, I do think there is a predisposition towards, well, it doesn't have to be socialism, but some kind of collective decision making, some kind of communal ethics, and that just makes liberalism, the liberal market economy, very counterintuitive.
So maybe the way to reconcile those two positions would be to say that we are exactly a generation after the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. In other words, the memory of what life under socialism really was like is now dissipating. It is amongst people my age and older, and somebody in their teens would not necessarily know what the whole thing was all about. And therefore, what I'm suggesting is that the waves that you talked about could be explained by, what people have experienced. Have they actually seen socialism collapse in practice? And then, if that memory goes, then the proclivity towards socialism, which may be innate, reasserts itself. Would that be a way to reconcile those two?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's exactly what's happening. Last year, we commissioned a survey on attitudes to socialism and capitalism among younger people. I wrote a report about this, where I talk about not just our survey, but the various surveys of that kind that already existed. So I tried to come up with the most complete summary that of attitudes to socialism, capitalism that you can find. And what I found was that it's fairly consistent that there is strong support for socialist ideas, however vague, among people in their 20s and 30s and maybe early 40s, and then around mid 40s or so there comes a cut-off point almost. I mean, okay, cut-off point sounds too drastic, but that's where you start to see a real change. People older than that, this socialism revival clearly hasn't reached them very much. It is almost exclusively something that's driven by people in their 20s and 30s. And I think that is explained by the lack of that memory. That so I remember that. So I was born in 1980, which means I don't specifically remember anything about the Cold War. I have early childhood memories of adults talking about it, but I can't say that I understood any of it at the time. But what I do remember is that in the 90s, if you talked about socialism and capitalism, economic ideas, it would the impression of the recent failure was still very much present. It was not something that happened ages ago, and but something that still influenced and informed day-to-day discussions. And there was this this end of history feeling that a lot of people would have said it would probably be almost a mainstream opinion to say, we've tried all that and it failed everywhere, so move on, forget about all this stuff. That doesn't mean that people at the time were super pro-capitalist. The idea was always, yes, capitalism is also flawed, and we need to come up with a reformed capitalism or something. But it was still very much. You had even people who were quite anti-capitalist would not say, I want to replace it with socialism. And that's something that somebody growing up in political terms in the 90s would remember. And that's why I think you do see this cutoff point that people who are younger than that, for them, that's no longer the case. They formed their political opinions at a time when the memory of Eastern Bloc socialist failure had already faded, and that doesn't mean that they know nothing about it. They can probably give you the dates, and they know what they learned in the history classes. It's just something that doesn't really connect very much. It's as if we talked about the Napoleonic Wars. Yes, we know that happened, and we may remember the names of some battles of it also, but we have no emotional connection with it either way. It doesn't shape the way we think about anything, and in that sense, it's gone. And you no longer get that immediate reaction that if somebody says I'm a socialist, that they wouldn't get the response, but that's been tried and failed, which in the 90s, yes, that would absolutely have been the answer. If you had said, I'm a socialist, that's what your opponents would have said. They would have said, yeah, tried, failed.
When you were a young person, did you and your parents ever drive from West Germany to East Germany in the 90s? And could you still see the difference in standards of living, the quality and the quantity of infrastructure, things like that? Was it obvious?
Sadly, I didn't go there until I think 2000 or 99, but I moved to East Berlin then in 2001. So 11 years after reunification, 12 years after the fall of the wall. Yeah, you could absolutely still see it. Economically, there had been a lot of catch-up growth. It didn't feel like being in a desperately poor place, but it still looked very, very socialist. There was the Alexanderplatz in the center, old center of East Berlin, still had these Soviet-type blocks and this horrible cladding around them that they had at the time. And just next to the university department, they had these larger-than-life Marx and Engels statues, and they're still there. They've been a bit removed because of some infrastructure project, but the statues are still there. There was a stained glass window in the university which has Lenin's head in it, and the kind of socialist realism art that was still everywhere. I think even today you will still see a lot of that. What's changed in the meantime is that if you go to that specific area now, you wouldn't immediately recognize that you're in the old East, because there's been a lot of redevelopment and Western hotel chains and supermarkets and whatever. But at the time, there was relatively little of that. So if you had wanted to do a movie, like Goodbye Lenin, I would imagine the filming for Goodbye Lenin would have been very easy. Of course, you have to get rid of some logos. So there were Western supermarkets. You could tell some things changed here. The cars were different, but otherwise, it's still you still had the backdrop. It's if I had fallen into a time hole and come out under real existing socialism, I would not have immediately noticed, I guess.
So we are we spent about an hour talking. So let's try to and on the following note, from your experience, what is the most powerful tool or argument to convince the young people that socialism is a bad idea? We have already discussed that, you know, the lack of historical memory plays a role in reviving socialism as a serious idea. But if we are going to succeed in preventing it from becoming a reality again, what argument should we use, especially with regard to the young, do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, if I knew how to prevent it, if I had a good, successful way of persuading people to abandon socialism, then I would have done it already. I would then be more successful at it than I am. So far, yeah, not very much, unfortunately. And that's partly because socialism has also, quite apart from whatever the attraction of the ideas may be, socialism has also become a fashion statement. It's cool and hip to be a socialist. And that makes it particularly hard, because convincing someone that they are wrong about a political idea is hard enough. But if you try to convince a socialist that they should not be a socialist, you're not just asking them to abandon an idea that they may like and feel comfortable with, you're also asking them to get rid of something that for them is a source of their social image. Something from which they derive their image of being hip and cool. And that's just something that's very hard to argue with. It would be, I mean, imagine you are a socialist in a trendy part of town, and you go to all the hipster bars there, and everyone is sort of a leftist, everyone is sort of a socialist, and you're the one who says, oh, actually I've read Hayek, and now I think maybe capitalism isn't so bad. I mean, your social reputation would just drop like a stone. You would now be one of the uncool people, and that makes it harder to convince, to talk people out of socialism. It's not just about ideas. It's about fashion statement. It's signaling things about yourself and the projecting an image of the kind of person you want to be. The only thing that I've found works a little bit is you have to show socialists how similar they sound to the people they would dismiss as not real socialists, so the people involved with earlier socialist projects. That's why in the book I try to come up with some Chavez quotes, which from the early stages of Venezuelan socialism, that if you read that, what Chavez said 17 years ago, it just sounds so much alike what a young socialist, a millennial socialist would say today. It's the same rhetoric, it's the same. Chavez also went on about how previous socialists were not real socialists, they just misunderstood Marx, and that's not at all what he was trying to do, and his version would be totally different. We have to reinvent it, and none of all that horrible bureaucracy and that authoritarianism, none of that will matter. We will do it totally differently. And if you just show a socialist a text of that kind, and you show them, and they realize, this guy sounds a lot like me, then you get a bit of a moment of self-doubt. Or even, I mentioned Lenin, even old Lenin texts. I mean, these people wouldn't read Lenin. They just think Lenin is some guy who misunderstood socialism, or he's some guy who didn't care about socialism, just wanted political power and just used socialism as a tool. So therefore, that's why millennial socialists would think there's nothing to learn from these earlier failures. These were just people who either cynically used the term socialism without actually meaning it, or people who didn't understand it. Whereas if you show them what those people actually said, and you show them that it's not true that they came up with the idea of creating a horrible dictatorship, if you show them that these people actually did think that their revolution would lead to a democratic, worker-run, self-organized society, and that they were rhetorically indistinguishable from today's millennial socialists, then I'm hoping at least some people would recognize, if these people sound so similar to me, how can I really claim that I'm the one who has magically reinvented socialism and transformed it into something totally different?
Well, that's a great way to end on. Perhaps another way to try would be to offer the most radical students in our colleges a ticket to Venezuela for a week or two, to go and check it out and experience on their own skin what real life under socialism is like. I wonder how many that would be.
Until a decade ago, you didn't have to offer tickets. A lot of them would have gone there voluntarily and come back and say, this is the real thing, this is brilliant. It's just that now Venezuela has moved into this, that wasn't socialism, you just don't understand it, to that stage.
Understood. So once again, the book is Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies by Kristian Niemietz from the Institute of Economic Affairs. I want to thank you very much for spending an hour with me. It was absolutely fascinating. We'll post the podcast, we will tweet out your book, and hopefully, fingers crossed, a lot of young people will buy it and learn from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.